So yeah, hi, I'm Bronte and I'm an honours student from the University of Wollongong, as you can probably tell from my background. So yeah, I'm presenting today on my thesis topic. So intra-family emotion work, 28 years on, one step back, two steps forward. And today I have my supervisor, Roger Patulny, presenting alongside with me. And he's just going to start us off and just run through some theories on emotion management.
Thanks a lot, Bronte. Would you mind if you can drive the slides? Yeah, Bronte will be talking to most of the slides. I'm just doing a really quick intro. So if you can go to the next one. Okay, great. What we're interested in today is developments around gender and emotion work. So it goes without saying that the gender division of labour is both problematic and ongoing. There's been some movement over the last number of decades towards improving the gender division of labour in some ways, but just as it feels like we're getting some headway going, we get COVID happen, and it feels like you're taking a big step backwards, as a lot of women are the ones taking on the care burden and excessive responsibility. Thanks a lot, COVID. But we're particularly interested in one aspect of care, which is emotion work. So just a little bit of terminology. The broader term, as used by Ali Hochschild, emotion management, captures how we adjust our display or even our experience of feeling and emotion to suit the social norms of a particular situation, or the feeling rules, as she puts it. And Hochschild, of course, notes this is highly gendered. And a subset of emotion management is emotion work. It actually divides into emotion labour and emotion work, but the labour is the paid part, and emotion work is the unpaid part that often happens within households between intimate partners. Now, the study that we are riffing off is Duncan and Marston, their 1993 study, which is quite prominent in the field of emotion work. Love and intimacy, gender division of emotion and emotion work. And it's a landmark study which kind of nailed this emotional inequality that exists between married heterosexual men and women, and how women perform more of the emotional work in the family home than the men did. And they were particularly focused on the emotional work that the women perform on their male partners, as well as in the space between them, to keep the relationship going well. Women work to maintain intimacy. Often this was resisted by emotionally inexpressive men or psychic celibates, as they were labelled. And women were more involved in reducing conflict, and they noted that men and women had incompatible goals, and they linked all this to sort of specialisation in different social roles and socialising and so forth. Now, this is quite a while back, 1993, so almost 30 years. And in the interim, there's been some other studies, but they generally uphold the idea that women come off worse in the emotional management, emotional work stakes. There's studies around surface and deep acting, which again implicates women in more of the surface stuff, and some other stuff about interpersonal emotional management as well. Would you mind going to the next slide, please? However, it's worth asking if things have changed in terms of the inequities or equities between men and women in this sense. For example, Giddens was famous for arguing that eventually we'd hit a form of emotional equality over time through the transformation of intimacy and the achievement of the pure relationship. But is there any evidence to support these ideas? And maybe it's time to have another look. I just want to quickly add that I was involved in a study a couple of years ago on men's affect. So this is from survey data, Australian national survey data, looking at emotions reported by men and women. And that study revealed more complexity than I think we normally attribute to men in terms of their emotional experiences. Whereby they showed more caring emotions than I think they're sometimes given credit for, particularly when cast as secondary rather than primary emotions. And we also want to talk a little bit about Marcy Cottingham's focus on emotional capital, that is the skill set that you have to be emotional, express emotions, and manage emotions. And Cottingham points out that while a lot of men don't start with this sort of capital, they can attain it in a secondary sense if they work in industries which often involve a lot of care work. So I guess, yeah, there's a bit of background, and now into Bronte's study. Over to you, Bronte.
Thank you. So yeah, I chose 3 theoretical perspectives to understand gendered patterns of behaviour. So the first one, gender essentialism, argues that the differences between men and women are rooted in their biology, so like genetically predetermined. And then we broke social constructionism into 2 forms, so hard and soft. So the first one regards gender as being strongly socially constructed, so whereby one learns to perform gender to uphold societal norms in fundamental ways. And then we also had, based on Giddens' structuration theory, soft social constructionism, so presenting individuals as knowledgeable agents who are confined to some extent by social structures, but are also aware of those structures and have agency to reflexively act outside of these structures. So we're not saying that gender differences are obsolete. We're just trying to shed light on a perspective that shows that, you know, men and women aren't always necessarily performing their gender. They do have agency to break away and are potentially influenced by other factors rather than gender. So my method, so recruitment occurred through a mixture of online and in-person convenience sampling strategies. The final sample was comprised of 14 participants. I completed in-depth semi-structured interviews over the phone and via Zoom, thanks to COVID lockdown measures. And then the data was transcribed and analysed thematically using codes and themes derived from the literature and interview transcripts. So I looked at the emotion work mothers and fathers perform for their children. I can't go through all these points, but I'll just touch on a few. So regarding gender essentialism and hard social constructionism, we found evidence of male interviewees performing more emotion work towards their sons. So that resembles prior research of how parents feel closer to their child of the same sex, or sex type their time investments with their children. The division of emotion work, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, so that also upholds quite expected gendered patterns. So where we're seeing that more women reported to perform the most emotion work for their children in their relationship. But we did also find other factors were affecting their emotion work rather than gender. So a main one was we found mothers adopting authoritative emotion management and fathers adopting caring emotion management. So previous research often presents fathers or men as completing more authoritative styles of interpersonal emotion management, and then women completing more sympathetic, caring, interpersonal emotion management. But we found the opposite in this study. And then I also looked at the emotion work men and women in heterosexual relationships perform for each other. So regarding gender essentialism and hard social constructionism, there was a finding that more men were opting to complete emotion work through the form of domestic labour. So there is a bit of tension of whether domestic labour can be considered as a form of emotion work, because it isn't that sitting down, actually communicating, actually discussing one's emotions. I'll be classifying, you know, sweeping the floor as a form of emotion work. But I found that in my study, the men were purposely completing domestic labour and domestic duties to intentionally enhance their partner's well-being. And for me, I want to recognise that as a form of emotion work, because you're still, you know, managing their emotions, you're still trying to do it for the benefit of your partner. And then regarding soft social constructionism, I found there was more evidence of men completing caring emotion management, so similar to the previous slide, but I also found men also engaging in this philanthropic style of emotion management as well. So this, in terms of the private sphere, can look like men and women giving that little bit extra beyond what is required from the feeling and framing rules of a situation. So out of a sense of commitment to their partner, they're not seeing it as a hassle or as a chore. They just generally want to perform it out of their personal desires and interests. And that wasn't recognised by the female interviewees. And then, as you can see from the division of emotion work, that is quite an unexpected division. So we see half the men and half the women interviewed reported performing more emotion work in their relationships. So that's, you know, different from previously recognised. We can, I guess, consider limitations of I wasn't able to interview the other partner, so I wasn't getting that clarity on responses. And there is obviously the element of perception bias if men or women were over-reporting their emotion work as well. And then, yeah, I also looked at the effect of the gender differences in family-oriented emotion work on the subjective well-being of parents in heterosexual relationships. So to break that down, I asked more broadly how the interviewees perceived performing emotion work for their children and for their partner. And so we looked at kind of positive emotions as linking to an enhanced well-being and negative emotions linking to a diminished well-being. So for regarding one's children, we can see that it's mostly positive. All interviewees found it satisfying. But then we also found that 7 of these interviewees did report negative emotions. However, I found that mothers were no more likely than fathers to experience these greater adverse impacts on their well-being, as you know, it's an even split between the genders. And then regarding one's partner, I found that it's mostly positive as well. So 11 interviewees enjoyed performing emotion work, but there were 8 interviewees that also reported negative emotions. And I found that out of these interviewees that reported the negative emotions, more of them were from the women in the study. However, these women also experienced positive emotions as well. So whether the negative emotions outweigh the positive emotions, yeah, that wasn't really being able to be found out in my study. And then we also looked at if one's negative emotions correlates to the division of emotion work in a heterosexual relationship. So in regards to performing emotion work for one's children, when I broke them into, you know, who said an uneven division and who said an even division, more women felt negative emotions out of those that said they had an uneven division. But then regarding the even division, yeah, more men felt negative emotions. And then regarding for performing emotion work for one's partner, regardless whether the division was even or uneven, even when I broke them down into those categories, more women felt negative emotions. So whether the division of emotion work is a factor in that, again, that's not entirely kind of determined here, but there is justifications of maybe women have more sympathy towards performing emotion work for their partners, for their children, which was recognised in my study. You know, they see it as kind of more of their role as a parent to perform emotion work, whereas they consider their partner more as their equal. So if they resent it more. And yeah, just to wrap up, so there were findings that reflected gender essentialism and hard social constructionism, obviously particularly how women are still performing most of the emotion work and they're encountering most of the negative effects. But I found that my findings do not strongly, well, they don't reflect strongly normative gender roles like previously recognised, as we are seeing that men are contributing more and they're displaying a greater desire to be more emotionally involved. And there are also other important factors that influence their emotion work as well. So these findings can definitely provide societal benefits, particularly in creating policies, so to further support parental leave entitlements, even flexible working arrangements. We're seeing that even more now with COVID. Women in particular are struggling even more to balance between the working from home kind of responsibilities of balancing work and home. So yeah, if we could encourage greater support for both genders so they can support their partner, that would be better. Having more awareness of men's emotional capital can encourage greater participation for men to be in care-based industries and reduce the stigma and prejudice that men in those care-based roles receive. And this study could also encourage further research into this field, so looking at even other family dynamics and units like blended families, single parent families. But yeah, although this study does provide more of a soft social constructionist position, this isn't to say that a gender division does not exist, but we just want to show that parents in heterosexual relationships are becoming much more reflexive agents by comparison and are slowly breaking away from predetermined gender roles. So yeah, hopefully offering a more positive, optimistic outlook for the future. And yeah, that's my references. But yeah, thank you for having me again. I feel really humbled to be here as an honours student, so thank you.
Oops, sorry. Thanks, Bronte. I should say we are humbled to have you because completing an honours project is already such an intensive thing to do, and doing it in a year like this, as the comments are saying, you know, is is super impressive. And then to present those findings at a symposium like this is at another level above. So that's just fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries. Sarah's got a question, so we'll go straight to Sarah.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Bronte, and thanks, Roger. That was such an interesting presentation. I'll sneak in two questions, actually. The first was, how did you explain to your participants what emotion work is? And secondly, what do people have to say about COVID and that impacting on, the emotional demands on them?
Yes, we based emotion work on the idea of like managing one's emotions. So we can do it on ourselves, we can practice it on others, or someone else can do it on us. And I did have to explain it to them because also they're not familiar with this sociological terminology. But yeah, just talking about like managing one's emotions. So whether you're trying to alter an emotion, evoke an emotion out of them, or conceal an emotion out of them, or also within yourself. I think people just see it as just like providing emotional support, but we're talking more about the actual modification of an emotion. And yeah, the other question to do with the COVID-19 impact, yeah, they talked a lot about the kind of managing between the work and home, like boundaries, and kind of disruptions of, like one person talked about like them working from home and their partner feeling like they can kind of keep like hanging out with them all the time, but they've got to create that boundary between just 'cause I'm home doesn't mean that I'm here all the time. So they found work as actually more of a stress on their ability to perform emotion work, like heightening emotions in the family home. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
If I can just add one thing to that, that question about COVID and its impact and the longer term changes that are going to come to the gender division of emotion work is something that Bronte and I would be quite interested in pursuing in the future as well with some more study, because I think it's going to be a very interesting space in the next few years, how we all reshuffle and rebalance, recalibrate, rebargain, whatever it's going to change.
Yeah, for sure.
Monica, go ahead.
Thanks, Bronte and Roger. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think a topic that's been really under-researched and really needs a bit of a new invigoration and update. I was wondering about whether all of your participants were born in Australia and came from an Anglo background, and whether or not cultural background would have an influence on these kinds of findings. I mean, perhaps that wasn't what your study looked at, but I'm curious about that aspect.
Yeah, cultural background and ethnicity wasn't a priority of the study. But yeah, everyone was living in Australia currently, aside from two people. So one person was from America and one person was from the UK. But the previous intention was to have everyone within like Wollongong and Sydney. But then when I got to do the interviews online, that kind of broadened the scope for us, which was, better, because with COVID, I struggled to get participants, so having that broader scope really benefited my study.
Awesome. Thanks again to Bronte and Roger.